The crowd held its breath. A four-star general, medals glinting beneath the afternoon sun, had just given an order that no one in the plaza thought they would ever hear. Arrest that guard. Gasps rippled through the silence like a gunshot. Parents pulled their children closer. Veterans stiffened, their jaws clenched in disbelief. Reporters raised their cameras, sensing history in the making, and yet, through the rising storm of whispers and flashing lenses, the tomb guard did not flinch. He stood motionless, rifle at his side, eyes locked forward, jaw carved in stone. His boots, polished so sharply they mirrored the sky, remained rooted to the marble floor as though he had become part of the monument itself. The general expected fear. He expected hesitation. He expected the guard to step aside under the crushing weight of authority. But the truth was older and heavier than his rank. It lived in the oath etched into the guard's soul, in the silent promise to defend what could never defend itself. The memory of the fallen. A hush spread wider. The general's command echoed again, sharper this time, like steel against glass. Still no movement, no words, only silence. It wasn't the silence of weakness. It was the silence of honor, a silence that made men shift uncomfortably in their uniforms, a silence that forced mothers in the crowd to wipe away tears they hadn't expected. For the first time in his decorated career, the general's certainty cracked. His stars glittered, but in front of him stood a man without a name, without recognition, without power yet somehow stronger. The crowd thought he would finally obey, that he would step aside, but in the next heartbeat, the world saw what discipline truly meant. The guard's rifle shifted by only an inch, yet it felt like thunder. His chin lifted, steady as the marble around him. His lips parted just enough for words that would slice through the arrogance of power and leave even the general frozen in his tracks. But before the world could hear them, there was only one undeniable truth written in the air. This was not a man standing before them. This was a symbol. And symbols, do not surrender. Asterisk. Long before the order of arrest thundered across the plaza, the tomb guard's story had already begun far away from polished boots, marble steps, and silent crowds. He had once been just another young soldier, 19 years old, face still too soft for war, thrown into the dust and chaos of a battlefield thousands of miles from home. The memories of that place were not medals or photographs. They were shadows. He had carried one of them back, a dog tag belonging to his best friend, a brother in arms who had fallen beside him when the world was fire and noise. That friend had once whispered to him during a night watch, "If we don't make it, promise me one thing, don't let them forget us." That promise became the silent oath that shaped the rest of his life. When the war ended, he could have chosen an easier path, but instead he sought the one duty where forgetting was impossible, guarding the resting place of those who could no longer speak for themselves. The tomb of the unknown soldier, a post where time, fatigue, and personal comfort were erased in the name of eternal vigilance. Every hour, every step, every turn of his rifle was drilled into him until he became less man and more monument. Rain or sun, day or night, storm or snow, he stood. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of tradition. His silence carried the weight of centuries. And so, when people looked at him, they didn't see a man with a past. They saw a living embodiment of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. But across the polished plaza that day stood another figure, one cloaked not in silence but in power. The four-star general, whose chest bore medals that gleamed like mirrors of history, was a man accustomed to obedience. Decades of service had carved his authority into stone. Soldiers saluted before his shadow touched them. Politicians sought his approval before making speeches. He was a man used to control. And yet, behind the shine of his rank, his motives today were not so pure. Rumors whispered that he had come to make a spectacle, to remind the world that stars on a shoulder outweighed tradition carved in marble. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps ambition, but to him, the guard was just another pawn. What he underestimated was this: the guard did not serve men, he served memory. The location itself amplified the tension. The plaza was not just stone and ceremony, it was hallowed ground. Every tile beneath the guard's boots was symbolic, each one echoing with footsteps of generations who had walked before him. Tourists often arrived laughing, but they always left whispering, subdued by a force they couldn't name. Children were told to hush here. Veterans straightened their shoulders here. Foreign visitors removed their hats, sensing that this place was not just American, it was human, a universal reminder of the cost of freedom. And in the middle of this sacred silence stood a man who had sworn never to move unless ordered by a tradition, older than any general, older than any flag. That morning, the crowd had gathered casually, expecting another silent watch. Families held cameras, children dangled ice creams, tourists lined the rails. Among them were reporters, their lenses hungry for a story, though none could predict the one that would unfold. When the general arrived, his presence bent the air like a storm cloud. Whispers passed through the onlookers. Some saluted, others frowned, sensing something uneasy in his tone. The way his eyes lingered too long on the guard, as if testing him, as if daring him, he stepped forward, boots clanging against the marble, his voice carrying authority that had once commanded thousands on battlefields. He began with remarks that seemed harmless, small comments about tradition, about time to modernize, about whether silence still mattered in a noisy world. At first, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure. Some nodded politely, others glanced at the guard, waiting for a response. But the guard gave none. His rifle remained steady, his stare fixed forward. The stillness became louder than any speech. The general's words sharpened. He spoke of control. He spoke of power. He spoke as if the guard were nothing but a statue to be moved at his whim. The crowd's reactions grew more divided. Children clung to their parents. Veterans bristled with quiet fury. Reporters scribbled notes with wide eyes. And through it all, the guard stood unshaken. This contrast, the immovable silence of one man against the restless noise of another, was the stage on which the coming storm would play out. For the guard it was simple. He had lived through chaos, through nights where the sky burned and the earth shook with artillery. Compared to that, one man's shouting meant nothing. He had promised a brother, he had sworn an oath. He would not break it. For the general, it was not so simple. Every second the guard refused to respond was like a crack in the glass of his authority. He was a man used to instant obedience, and now before cameras, before civilians, before veterans, he found himself ignored. That kind of silence can humiliate more than any insult. That kind of silence can destroy power. The stage was set, the crowd leaned closer, and deep within the guard's stillness, something unspoken warned. If the general chose to push further, if he crossed the invisible line of tradition, the world would witness a truth no rank could silence. The silence should have ended there. The general could have walked away, satisfied with his presence and his glittering stars. But pride is a heavy burden, and in the plaza that day, his pride grew louder than tradition. He took another step toward the guard, the sound of his heel against marble echoing like a drumbeat. His voice, sharp and cutting, carried across the hushed crowd. "Do you even hear me, soldier? Or are you just a puppet in a uniform?" Gasps rippled through the air. A few tourists exchanged uneasy glances. One child asked his mother in a whisper, "Why is he yelling at him?" Veterans tightened their jaws. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing to capture every second. The guard didn't blink. His rifle remained steady, his eyes locked forward. His silence was not emptiness, it was a statement stronger than any words. But to the general, that silence was an insult. He circled slowly, his decorations glinting beneath the sun, each step a reminder of his authority. "I said, arrest him," he barked, pointing to a pair of junior officers at his side. They hesitated. Their eyes darted between the immovable guard and the restless crowd. They had trained their whole careers to obey, but something in the air warned them that this command was different. This was not war. This was tradition versus ego. The officers froze, unable to move. The crowd sensed the tension. The plaza had become a battlefield without bullets. The general smirked, mistaking hesitation for weakness. He turned back toward the guard, lowering his voice to a cold sneer. "You think standing here makes you a man of honor? You're just a statue, nothing more. A body in a uniform, wasting taxpayers' money." The words cut like knives, and the reaction was immediate. A veteran in the crowd shouted, "Watch your tongue, General." Another raised his hand in salute toward the guard, defying the authority standing only feet away. Children clung to their parents, sensing danger though not fully understanding. A group of tourists lowered their phones, realizing this was no performance. This was history unraveling before them. Still the guard remained motionless. His stillness became a mirror. The more the general shouted, the more the guard's silence exposed his arrogance. Each insult he hurled only deepened the contrast between power and principle, between rank and honor. The sun grew hotter, pressing down on the plaza. Sweat beaded on the general's brow, though his pride forced him to press on. He leaned closer to the guard, his voice dripping venom. "Do you know who I am? I command armies. I've written history with my victories, and you've forgotten the moment you stepped down. You're nothing." For a fraction of a second, the guard's jaw tightened, but he did not move. His eyes never wavered. The crowd noticed. A murmur passed through them like a wave. Even children could feel it. This silence was not fear. It was defiance without violence. Reporters whispered to each other, "This is bigger than a story. This is a symbol." Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the bead of sweat on the general's forehead, the marble firmness of the guard's stance. The general's frustration grew into fury. Authority had always bent to his will, but here, in front of strangers, civilians, veterans, and children, his authority was being quietly dismantled by a man who refused to move or speak, and so he escalated further. He reached out, a hand hovering dangerously close to the guard's shoulder. The crowd gasped, sensing the invisible line about to be crossed. Tradition was sacred. No one touched a tomb guard on duty, not even the president himself. The air thickened. Cameras clicked like gunfire. A child whimpered. Veterans muttered prayers, and yet the guard did not flinch. His breath was steady, his stance rooted. His silence grew so loud that even the birds above seemed to pause mid-flight. The general hesitated, his hand trembling in the air. For a heartbeat, he realized that touching the guard would not be an act of authority, but an act of desecration. Still, his pride refused to let him back down. His fingers inched closer until he finally brushed the guard's sleeve. The crowd erupted in gasps. A veteran shouted, "Out of line." Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, their flashes blinding in the sunlight. But the guard, he remained as stone. His discipline was unbreakable, his silence immovable, and in that silence the general's power began to crack. Some in the crowd grew restless. "Why doesn't he say something?" one tourist muttered. "Because he doesn't have to," whispered an old soldier, tears glistening in his eyes. The guard's silence carried the weight of every fallen comrade, every forgotten hero, every promise etched into the marble beneath their feet. His stillness was not weakness, it was strength distilled to its purest form. The general, now red-faced, shouted louder, spittle flying from his lips. His insults turned desperate. "You shame this country. You shame this uniform." The irony struck the crowd like lightning. It wasn't the guard who shamed the uniform, it was the man yelling in its name. Murmurs of agreement rippled. Veterans shook their heads. Even the hesitant officers beside the general shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing a collapse of dignity. Minutes stretched like hours. The general hurled every weapon he had, insults, threats, orders, but none pierced the armor of silence. The guard's discipline turned into something divine, something untouchable. The longer he stood still, the more the crowd began to side with him. Parents whispered to their children, "Remember this moment. This is what honor looks like." A young boy, no older than 8, clutched a toy soldier in his pocket and stared with wide eyes. To him, the guard wasn't just a man, he was a living statue of courage. Proof that even against the greatest power, one could stand unshaken. Finally, the general snapped. His voice rose above the crowd like thunder. "I order you." The words echoed, rattling against the marble, breaking into silence that seemed eternal. The plaza froze. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a sound. The guard's chin lifted by a single inch. His rifle shifted just enough to remind the world it was there. His stillness spoke louder than any scream. "I will not move." The crowd erupted not in noise, but in awe. Mothers wiped tears. Veterans saluted. Reporters captured the moment, knowing it would burn across every screen by nightfall. The conflict had reached its breaking point. The general, humiliated before his own men and the world, had unleashed every weapon pride could offer, and yet he stood defeated by silence. The stage was set. The turning point loomed, and in the next heartbeat, the guard's disciplined response would change everything. The air was a battlefield of silence. The general's command move still echoed against the marble, but the guard's unflinching stillness turned that command into a hollow sound, quickly swallowed by the vast plaza. For a long moment, nothing happened. The crowd stood frozen, breaths locked inside their chests. The general's face flushed crimson, stars on his shoulders gleaming like fire under the unforgiving sun. His authority had been challenged, his pride stripped raw in front of civilians, soldiers and cameras. And pride, when cornered, is dangerous. The general lunged forward, not with a fist, not with a weapon, but with his hand, clamping down hard on the guard's shoulder. The gasp that ripped through the crowd felt like thunder. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Veterans growled in fury. Reporters shoved forward, cameras firing like artillery. Everyone knew what had just happened. The sacred line had been crossed. A tomb guard is never touched. Not by strangers. Not by tourists. Not even by generals. The contact was not just disrespect. It was desecration. The guard's body reacted with a precision born from years of unbreakable training. His rifle snapped upward, the butt slamming against his shoulder in a fluid motion so swift it seemed almost inhuman. The metallic click rang like a bell of judgment, silencing every voice in the plaza. The general froze. The crowd gasped as one. The rifle's muzzle was not pointed at the general. Discipline forbade that. Instead, it angled across his chest, inches away, a silent barrier of steel that screamed louder than any weapon. The guard's boots clicked as he pivoted, his body now squared against the general, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his cap, burned forward with a fire no rank could extinguish. And then, for the first time, his voice cut through the air. Step back, 2 words, firm, controlled, unshaken. The sound was not loud, yet it carried more weight than the general's shouting ever had. It was the voice of tradition, of centuries of sacrifice condensed into a single command. The crowd erupted. Veterans snapped into salute, tears streaming down their weathered faces. Children clutched their parents tighter, whispering, "He spoke." Reporters surged forward, tripping over one another to capture every frame, every syllable. The general stood paralyzed. For all his stars, all his medals, all his decades of command, he was now the one obeying. The silence that followed was suffocating, electric, eternal. The guard's rifle remained steady, his body a monument of discipline. His eyes never wavered, his jaw carved from stone. The words he had spoken still rang in the air, echoing like a sacred vow. The general's lips parted as if to respond, but no sound emerged. For the first time in his career, he had no command to give. His authority had been shattered not by violence, but by unshakable stillness and the truth it carried. And the truth was this: no rank could override honor, no stars could outweigh sacrifice, no general could silence memory. The crowd's reaction grew stronger. A veteran shouted, voice breaking, "That's a soldier." A mother wiped her tears, whispering to her child, "Remember this day. Remember him." Reporters, their hands shaking with adrenaline, spoke into microphones. "History is happening right before us." The guard had spoken only 2 words, but they had stripped the general bare. The general, his pride bleeding into shame, attempted one last move. He stepped forward again, chest puffed, forcing a sneer across his face. "You dare." But before he could finish, the guard's rifle shifted sharply downward, the metal butt slamming against the marble with a crack that echoed like a cannon. The sound jolted the air, reverberating off the stone, silencing everything once more. His voice followed, calm, precise, immovable. "This post is sacred. No one crosses it, not even you." 3 sentences, delivered without trembling, without fear. The kind of words that are not spoken by men but by symbols. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, breaking the solemn air with a roar of approval. Veterans saluted again, hands trembling. Children clapped without fully understanding why, sensing only that something historic had just happened. Even the hesitant junior officers behind the general lowered their heads, ashamed of their commander's arrogance. For the first time, the general's authority collapsed before his own eyes. His stars glittered but hollow. His voice faltered but could not rise. His hand shook as he lowered it from the guard's shoulder. He staggered backward, his boots scraping against the marble. The guard, however, did not move an inch. His rifle remained steady. His body remained a monument. His silence returned, heavier and more powerful than before. The message was clear. This was not about a man versus a general. This was about honor versus pride, and pride had been defeated in that moment. The world shifted. The cameras had captured everything: the touch, the defiance, the words, the rifle striking the marble. Within hours, the footage would spread across screens and networks, igniting debates in parliaments, living rooms, and classrooms. But in that plaza, time seemed frozen. The guard slowly resumed his stance as if nothing had happened. His silence returned, his rifle resting by his side, his eyes fixed forward once again. The crowd whispered, almost reverently, "He's still on duty." That was the shocking truth. After humiliating the most powerful man in uniform, after defending the sanctity of his post with words that would echo for generations, he simply returned to silence, because for him, this was not about victory. It was about duty. The general stumbled backward into the crowd, his face pale, his stars suddenly heavy. The officers who had once flanked him now avoided his gaze. He opened his mouth as if to reclaim authority, but no one listened. The power had shifted, not to him, not to the crowd, but to the garden through him, to every soldier who had ever fallen nameless and forgotten. In that single turning point, the world saw something unforgettable. The collapse of arrogance, the rise of silent honor, the living proof that tradition is stronger than authority, and silence louder than pride. The guard had spoken only a handful of words, but they would echo across history. And as the crowd slowly rose to its feet, saluting the man who stood alone, the general realized the most humiliating truth of all. He had ordered the guard's arrest, but in the end it was his own legacy that had been arrested. The plaza was no longer the general's stage. It belonged to the silence, a silence carved by the guard's words, a silence that weighed heavier than medals and sharper than swords. The general, chest still heaving, tried to stand tall. His lips trembled with the urge to reclaim control, but his authority had already shattered. The stars on his shoulders glittered, not as symbols of command, but as ornaments of arrogance exposed. The crowd was no longer neutral. They had chosen their side. Veterans, with hands trembling from age and memory, snapped into perfect salutes facing the guard. The sound of palms striking brows rippled across the plaza like a wave of respect. Tears streaked down weathered faces that had seen combat, loss, and silence of their own. A mother whispered to her son, "That's honor, not rank." The boy nodded and pressed a toy soldier against his chest as though it had come alive before him. Reporters broadcasted breathlessly, their microphones trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, history is happening here. A guard has just defied a 4-star general and the world is watching." The general's fury turned to humiliation. He barked one last order, desperate, clinging to fragments of power, "Arrest him, now." But no one moved, not the officers, not the crowd, not even his own aides, who looked away in shame. For the first time in his life, the general stood truly alone. The guard lowered his rifle with slow, precise grace. The marble still echoed with the crack from moments earlier, a sound that had already become legend. His movements were flawless, not rushed, not hesitant. Each second declared to the world, discipline does not bend, honor does not break. Then he stepped back into formation, heel to toe, rifle aligned, eyes forward. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the storm had never touched him. The symbolism struck the crowd like lightning. The guard had faced arrogance, insult, even physical violation of his sacred duty, and yet he returned to stillness, untouched. Unbroken. He was not fighting the general, he was guarding the unknown. The general tried to speak again, but the words died in his throat. Every eye in the plaza had turned against him. Even the cameras, though aimed at his decorated chest, betrayed him because they captured only the sweat on his brow, the crack in his jaw, the shame in his stance. It was over. Not by force, not by rebellion, but by silence. The crowd began to cheer, not with the raucous noise of stadiums, but with the deep, reverent applause of people who had just witnessed something eternal. Each clap echoed with meaning. Each shout of "Stand strong" carried the weight of truth. The guard did not acknowledge them. He did not bow, smile, or nod. He simply stood, immovable, eternal, exactly as he had been before the chaos began. And that was the true humiliation for the general. He had shouted until his voice broke. He had touched what should never be touched. He had commanded until his authority collapsed. And still, the guard stood as though the world around him was nothing more than wind against stone. The general staggered backward, retreating into the crowd he could no longer control. Cameras followed, reporters swarming, questions slicing through him like blades. Why did you order his arrest? Do you regret your actions, General? How do you justify violating sacred tradition? But there were no answers, only silence, not from the guard, but from the man who had once commanded armies. Above the crowd, the flag fluttered gently in the wind. Its fabric caught the sunlight, draping the entire moment in a glow of symbolism. The fallen were honored. The tradition stood unbroken. And at the center of it all was one guard, rifle at his side, unmoving, unshaken. The cameras zoomed in on his face, calm, steady, anonymous. No name, no recognition. Just a symbol. And symbols cannot be humiliated. Symbols cannot be arrested. Symbols endure. By the time the general was escorted away, not in triumph, but in disgrace, the world had already chosen its headline. Tomb Guard defies. General honor over rank. The video spread within hours, igniting millions of screens. Children repeated his words in school. Veterans replayed the rifle's strike against the marble, hearing in it the echo of their own sacrifices. Families sat in silence, explaining to their young what tradition truly means. But the guard himself remained unaware. He would not see the headlines, nor the viral videos, nor the praise, because he was still standing watch, still guarding those who could not guard themselves, still silent. And that was the greatest climax of all. A man had humbled power itself and then returned to duty. As though nothing had happened. The general was gone, dragged not by force, but by the weight of his own humiliation. The echoes of his shouting had vanished, replaced by a reverent hush that filled the plaza like a hymn, but the guard remained unmoving, unbroken, unchanged. The world around him had erupted into history, yet for him duty was eternal. His rifle rested at his side, boots rooted in the marble. His eyes stared forward, not at the cameras, not at the crowd, but at the tomb he had sworn to protect, for in the end, that was all that mattered. Slowly, from among the crowd, an older colonel stepped forward. His hair was silver, his back slightly bent from years of service, but his eyes gleamed with a fire that had never dimmed. He removed his hat, his hand trembling as he raised it into a salute. The gesture spread like wildfire. Veterans across the plaza straightened their spines, hands snapping to brows with precision they had not practiced in years. Civilians followed, awkward but earnest. Even children, sensing the gravity of the moment, placed small hands over their hearts. That it was not the guard who moved them, it was what he represented, the promise that honor lives, even when power fails. Somewhere in the crowd, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the hush of the moment, it carried farther than anyone expected. He's a hero. The word hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. Mothers wept softly, fathers nodded, veterans closed their eyes, remembering faces long gone, and the guard. He did not move, he did not react, for a true hero does not need to claim the title. He only needs to keep his oath, inside his heart. However, a quiet storm stirred. The guard's hand brushed briefly against his pocket, where a worn dog tag pressed against his uniform. The name etched into it was the same friend he had lost years ago, the one who had whispered a final plea on a battlefield far from here. Promise me they won't forget us. The guard's jaw tightened, but his stance remained unbroken. In that moment, he knew the promise had been kept. The fallen had not been forgotten. Their memory had been defended not with bullets, but with silence. Reporters lowered their cameras, unable to intrude further on the sacredness of the moment. Families wiped their eyes. Veterans saluted longer than their arms could bear. And yet, through it all, the guard resumed his duty exactly as tradition demanded. The rifles clicked. The silent march continued. The post was unchanged, and that was the point. For traditions this strong are not bent by arrogance, not broken by pride. They endure because they are built on the backs of those who gave everything. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying with them a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. They would say they were there the day a tomb guard defied a general. They would say they heard two words that shook the world: step back. But more than that, they would remember the silence that followed, the silence that proved strength is not always in the noise, but in the stillness. The guard remained alone once more, as he had been before the storm began. He did not seek the crowd. He did not need applause, for he was not standing for them. He was standing for the nameless, for the lost, for the forgotten. And as the flag rippled in the golden light, the truth was clear. Power fades, pride crumbles, but honor endures forever. And so, the plaza returned to silence. The marble walls gleamed under the fading light, the flag above swayed gently in the evening wind, and the tomb guard remained, still, unshaken, eternal. What had unfolded that day was not just a clash between a man in uniform and a man with stars. It was a clash between pride and principle, between power and honor, and in the end, the world witnessed the truth. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. The four-star general had walked away, but his defeat was not delivered by force. It was delivered by the one thing he could not command: respect. The crowd did not remember his medals. They did not remember his words. But they remembered the silence of the guard. They remembered the way an unbroken stance spoke louder than any shouted order. And that memory will live longer than any rank, any title, any fleeting authority. Generations from now, children will still hear the story. They will hear of the day a guard was ordered to surrender his post, and how he did not move. They will learn that discipline is not blind obedience, but a higher calling. That true strength is not measured in how loudly one commands, but in how deeply one stands for what is right, because in the end, that's what the guard showed us. Duty outlives power. Maybe you were moved when the colonel raised his salute. Maybe your heart stirred when the child whispered, "He's a hero." Or maybe you felt the quiet fire when you saw a man refuse to step aside, even when threatened. Wherever it touched you, remember this: it was not just a story about a soldier. It was a reminder about us, about how we face pressure, about how we choose between compromise and conviction. Because one day, you too will stand at a crossroads, and you'll hear a voice of authority telling you to step aside. The question is, will you? As the final light of day washed over the monument, the guard remained alone, yet not alone, for in his stillness, he carried the weight of every soldier before him, and the silent hope of every citizen watching. And so I ask you if this story stirred you, if it reminded you that honor still matters, don't let it end here. Carry it forward, share it, speak of it, let others know that strength is not always about power. Sometimes it is about the courage to stand still, because heroes are not only found in the chaos of battle, sometimes they are found in the silence after.